Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on with our conversation from last time, which is commercial agriculture, and we're going through the different types of commercial agriculture. So the last time we were together we discussed plantation agriculture and we talked about Mediterranean agriculture. So today we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what's called mixed crop and livestock agriculture as well as ranching. So when we talk about mixed crop and livestock agriculture, it's different from Mediterranean and plantation agriculture because we predominantly find this in more developed countries. Now, based on the name, it should be pretty easy for you to tell what's going on in these particular farms. We have a situation where typically people who live in areas where there's less land available, typically you tend to have higher populations, and so the farms can't be quite as big. And so because the farms can't be quite as big, the farmers kind of diversify among the different types of things that they're raising so that they can have more options of selling things and selling items. And also they tend to be closer to markets, and so they have a variety of different things to sell to their markets. So the farm is a mixture of crops and then livestock that they're also raising on that farm. Now there's a particular system that they set up for the mixed crop and livestock. We'll do that in just a minute. So anyway, on the mixed crop and livestock, of course, you have the different crops that are available, and of course, that's going to really depend on where the farm is located. But typically, you're going to find things like wheat, corn. You might have some gourd type plants that are grown like squashes and things along those lines. But then you're also going to have some animals, whether it be cows or cattle, sheep, goats, and I guess there should be a comma in between goats and ducks. There's no such thing as a goats, ducks. Sorry about that. Goats, ducks, and chickens, and I guess I should have deleted the comma after chickens. So I apologize for those grammatical errors. But on the mixed crop and livestock farm, typically it's going to be the cattle or the animals that are going to be bringing in the money, not so much the crops. In fact, the crops are predominantly grown in order to feed the cattle. The idea there is you save the money on cattle feed by growing and raising the crops to feed to the cattle, so that you don't have to purchase that. The cattle are then going to provide fertilizer to fertilize the crops, as well as other items such as the wool from a sheep, the hair from a goat, the eggs from chickens, then also things like duck eggs, and then of course milk from cows. And of course in any of those you could also sell the meat from the animals. But as we discussed earlier, typically that's not always done, especially on smaller scale operations, because with those situations, it takes a long time to raise the animal, and then once the animal's gone, you no longer have the animal, so they can't produce the other things they had for you. And of course, by the end of the life cycle, maybe you might do those things with the animals, but again, a lot of times these animals are actually more valuable for the items that they produce. So on these farms, if they are commercial agriculturalists, for the most part, they're going to depend on the animals for their income and the things that they're selling from the animals. And typically these tend to be much smaller scale operations because of the locations that they find themselves in, smaller farms, higher density areas, and closer to markets. Some of the things that are beneficial about the mixed crop and livestock is that they're not really dependent on the weather, because animals are obviously not impervious to weather, but they're much more resistant to weather than crops are. So you're much less likely to have issues, whether it's too cold or too hot, whether it's snowing, any of those types of things. As long as, of course, the animals have some sort of shelter, especially some of the smaller animals. Again, you're going to find these in more developed countries, especially places like Western Europe and the Eastern United States. Again, where less land is available. I already mentioned that. That's this point here. And then also you're going to find the elements of crop rotation found on these farms, so that the crop areas are remaining in production over time. And of course, you saw the cows here in this particular picture. You see how they're feeding on grass, things like that. That's really become something that's become more popular in the United States and in recent years, is having grass-fed beef. And so, especially when there's greater concern over the types of food that the animals are eating, and so people are actually going more for grass-fed beef instead of corn-fed beef. The last type of agriculture practice we're going to look at today is ranching. Ranching is really just a commercial form of pastoralism. So it's pastoralism on a much larger scale. It's pastoralism with a lot more animals and obviously a lot more land that is available. So it's much more extensive, really, than pastoralism. And aside, just like we talked about with pastoralism, pastoralism is primarily you're not going to use the animals for consumption. Well, it's exactly the opposite for ranching. In ranching, the main purpose of ranching is to sell the meat that's going to come from the cows. So you raise the cows for a period of time, and then they're going to be sold off to market. The two animals that are predominantly raised in ranching are going to be sheep and cattle. And sheep, of course, can be raised either for their meat or for their wool, and then cattle are predominantly raised, in this case, for their meat. Of course, there are other options that you can have with cattle when it comes to dairy products, things like that, but in ranching, you're strictly going to be using those cattle for their meat. You find ranching in more developed countries, in areas that tend to be dry, very arid, areas that are not necessarily good for growing and raising crops. So you can see here some of the different places we find them. Western United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. One of the things, though, again, I mentioned this earlier, that's become more popular recently, and because it's more expensive, is that in the United States we feed a lot of our cattle with corn, whereas in South America it's become very popular for cattle to be fed predominantly grass. And so you'll see some of those distinctions maybe in your grocery store. Maybe your parents have become very concerned with those types of things. And again, a lot of that has to do just kind of with our modern food movement that we've seen. One of the greatest concerns that a lot of people have, and you can see this on a variety of different videos and movies, whether it's Food Inc. or any of the other ones that have come out, and Chipotle commercials, you can see those are what are called fattening farms. And so essentially, to replace ranching and to get away from having to use all that space and become more efficient with cattle production, is at the very end of a cow's life, they might be put on one of these fattening farms, and you can see the cows very close together. They're living in relatively unsanitary conditions. This is where people talk about antibiotics and animals having to be fed antibiotics because they're living in these kinds of conditions, constantly using the bathroom next to each other, and the potential for infection. You can see the cows have their heads in these troughs here, and this is predominantly going to be grain that's being fed to them, predominantly corn. And so when we think about corn production, where all of our corn goes to, aside from human consumption and cattle consumption, you also have things like ethanol, things along those lines. But again, you have the fattening farm situation here. Sorry about that. You have the fattening farm situation here, and then the production facility is very close by to try and cut down on the cost and the time of meat production for these fattening farms. And again, any of these videos that you see coming out really today that go against the industrial food movement probably will talk to you about fattening farms or things along those lines. And that's all that we have time for today, except for one last quiz ferret today. Quiz ferret, our fuzzy little friend Quiz ferret, has popped his head out of the ground. He has a question for us, so see how you do. So our question for today is, what type of commercial agriculture was practiced in LDCs, or less developed countries? So pause the video, take a second, see if you know. So that's going to be plantation and Mediterranean agriculture. So of course you got that right, because you've been watching the videos and paying close attention. So that's all we have time for today. I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, fill out the comment box below, and I hope to see you next time.